Hey friends, tonight we're stepping back into ancient Rome, somewhere most history books leave alone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There's something strangely calming about knowing others are listening to these same quiet stories at the same time, even from different places, in different nights of the world. So if you're still awake with me, you can simply settle in now. Let the lights soften a little, maybe let the room feel a bit heavier, a bit quieter. And let's ease into tonight's quiet hour together. Tonight, you are not in your bedroom anymore. You are somewhere older. The air is damp and faintly sulphurous. There is the sound of water. Not running water, not clean water. Water that has been sitting in a stone basin since before you arrived, shared by everyone who came before you. Somewhere ahead, someone laughs. Somewhere behind, a door scrapes shut. Welcome to the Roman bathhouse. You arrive in the late afternoon. This is intentional. The baths open around midday and run until dusk. But the hour just before sunset is when the serious business happens. When the men who matter and the men who want to matter come to be seen. You know this, everyone knows this. Showing up at dawn marks you as either very poor or very strange, and in Rome, both carry consequences. You pay your entrance fee at the door. It is almost nothing but quadrans, the smallest coin in circulation, roughly what a laborer earns in 5 minutes. The emperor subsidizes the rest. This is not generosity. It is politics. A clean, entertained population is a quiet one, and the emperors have done the arithmetic. You hand over your coin and step inside. The first room is the apoditorium, the changing room. Long stone benches line the walls. Niches are carved above them, each just wide enough for a folded tunic. You begin to undress. Here is where the first rule applies, and it is unspoken, which makes it more dangerous than the written kind. You do not watch other men undress. You do not make eye contact with slaves attending their masters. You do not place your clothes in a niche already occupied, or reach past a man of higher status to access one. The changing room is a social minefield dressed as a stone corridor, and you have been navigating it since childhood without ever being taught how. There is one thing every visitor carries into the baths. It is not a towel. Most Romans do not use towels in any sense you would recognize. We will come back to it. You leave your clothes in the niche. You have paid, or your master has paid, for a slave to stand beside them. His only job for the next 2 hours is to watch your tunic. Theft in the apoditorium is so common that the satirist Martial wrote about it more than once. Men leaving the baths poorer than they arrived, not in health, but in linen. The slave is not a luxury. He is insurance. You move into the tepidarium next. This is the warm room, not hot, not cool, but the threshold between them, kept at a temperature that loosens the muscles without shocking the system. The floor is heated from below. There are channels beneath the stone, a system called the hypocaust, through which hot air circulates from a furnace tended by slaves in a basement you will never see. The men shoveling fuel down their work in temperatures that exceed anything you will experience up here. This detail does not trouble most visitors. You sit. You breathe. The room smells of oil and sweat, and something mineral underneath, the sulfur from the water source, or perhaps the plaster on the walls, slowly sweating in the heat. Around you, men do business, merchants discuss contracts, senators trade information that will not appear in any official record. A doctor sits with a patient, taking his pulse in the warmth, nodding slowly. The baths are not a place for washing. That is a modern misunderstanding, and it is worth correcting early. The baths are an office. They are a forum. They are a dining room that doesn't serve food and a library that doesn't have books. The Romans bathe, yes, but bathing is almost incidental to what the bathhouse actually does, which is run the city. But that wasn't the strangest part. The object you carried in with you, the one that is not a towel, is a small flask. Ceramic, sometimes metal if you can afford it, stoppered with a cork or a cloth plug. Inside it is oil, specifically olive oil, though cheaper grades existed for those who couldn't manage the real thing. You also carry, or have a slave carry for you, a strigil. The strigil is a curved metal blade, shaped like a sickle, roughly the length of your hand with a dull edge and a slight hook at the tip. It is the Roman answer to soap, which they do not use in any meaningful sense. The procedure is as follows. You coat your skin in oil, work it into the surface, and then scrape. The strigil removes the oil along with whatever the oil has loosened, dirt, dead skin, sweat, and whatever the city of Rome has deposited on you during your walk to the baths. The resulting paste, grayish, oily, faintly warm, collects on the blade and is flicked onto the floor or into a bowl, depending on where you are and how the establishment is run. Here is the part that requires a moment to absorb. This paste was sold, not discarded, sold. Specifically, the scrapings from famous athletes and gladiators were collected, bottled and marketed as a medicinal and cosmetic product. Galen, the Roman physician who treated emperors, mentions the practice without particular surprise. The sweat and skin cells of a champion, it was believed, carried some portion of his strength. Women applied it to their skin. Men rubbed it into sore joints. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Specifically, imagine explaining it to the man at the gladiatorial school whose job it was to collect the scrapings. He had a job title. Death wasn't tragic. It was practical. And the bathhouse economy was built on things most people prefer not to think about. There is one more rule you learn eventually about the strigil. In a well-run bathhouse, you bring your own. In a cheaper establishment, or if you have forgotten yours, you can borrow one. The strigil passes between strangers without comment. It is cleaned after a fashion between uses wiped on a cloth, dragged across a wet stone, but you understand, standing in that warm room, holding a curved blade that has scraped the skin of men you have never met, that the Roman concept of hygiene runs along entirely different lines than yours. It was not uncleanliness, it was community. The Romans had a phrase, *mens sana in corpore sano*, a healthy mind in a healthy body, that has survived 2,000 years. What they meant by healthy body would take some explaining. 3 things had to go right for a bathhouse visit to end well. You had to arrive at the correct social hour. You had to manage the changing room without incident. And you had to navigate the hot room, the caldarium, without sitting in the wrong seat. The third is the one that required the most attention. The caldarium was the final stage, a room kept at near scalding temperatures, filled with steam, containing 1 or more large basins of hot water. This is the room most people picture when they picture Roman bathing. It is also the room with the steepest social geography. The basins are shared. The seating around them is not formally assigned, but the assignment is understood. Senators and their clients cluster near one end. Freedmen occupy the middle. The poorer visitors, those who came in on their 1 quadrans and have no slave attending their clothes, take what remains. Sitting in the wrong section does not get you removed immediately. Best case scenario, a slave hired by the establishment approaches and quietly suggests you might be more comfortable elsewhere. Worst case scenario, you have placed yourself adjacent to a man who has both land and a very long memory, and your afternoon has taken a turn you will spend some time recovering from. The water by late afternoon is gray. Everyone knows this. Everyone enters it anyway. It was the baths. It was the city. It was Tuesday. And while Rome kept its rules for skin and oil and stone basins, it also kept rules for something far more pressing, the question of what you were allowed to eat, and more importantly, what the man selling it to you had quietly done to it first. Welcome to the Roman street at the 7th hour. The sun is overhead and slightly past it. The morning's work, if you have work, is done. The afternoon's obligations have not yet begun. This is the hour when the city exhales, when the noise shifts register from the sharp clatter of commerce to something slower and more animal. Somewhere, a man is arguing about the price of figs. Somewhere else, 2 women are eating from a shared bowl in a doorway, standing up, not speaking. You are hungry. This is not a simple problem in Rome. It is, depending on where you live and who you are, a problem with no clean solution, only a series of workarounds, each with its own complications. You live in an insula, a 6-story apartment block, one of the tens of thousands stacked across the city like compressed linen, floor above floor. The higher you go, the cheaper the rent, and the thinner the walls. Your room is on the 4th floor. It has a window, a straw mattress, a small table, and no kitchen. There is no kitchen because there is no kitchen anywhere in the building. This is not an oversight. It is the law. Open fires in multi-story wooden apartment blocks had, on several occasions, erased entire Roman neighborhoods before dawn. The city had learned this lesson the way cities always learn it, expensively and more than once. The result was a blanket prohibition on cooking fires in most insulae. In the higher floors especially, you could not cook. You could not even keep a brazier burning past a certain hour. This meant that the majority of Rome's population, estimates suggest a city of around 1 million at its peak, ate almost every meal outside, not by choice, by architecture. And the city had built itself around this fact with the same practical efficiency it applied to everything else. On almost every block, sometimes several per block, you will find a thermopolium. The word means, roughly, a place where hot things are sold, and the Romans understood it to mean approximately what you understand by fast food: a counter, a selection, a transaction conducted standing up and completed in under 5 minutes. There is one ingredient in almost every Roman dish that modern food safety law would classify as a public health hazard. We will get to it. You stop at the counter nearest to your building. You have stopped here before. The man behind it knows your face, though not your name. The counter is a wide slab of stone or masonry, embedded into the front of the building like a bar facing the street. Set into its surface are circular openings, sometimes 2, sometimes 6 or 8, each leading down into a large ceramic vessel called a dolium, buried in the counter itself for insulation. The dolia are deep and wide, sealed with lids when not in use. Some contain stew. Some contain dried legumes softened overnight in water. Some contain wine or posca, a mixture of water and vinegar that soldiers drink and that civilians drink when wine is either unavailable or unwise. The food keeps warm in the stone, not hot, not precisely, not by late afternoon, but warm enough. And in a city where the alternative is cold food eaten alone in a room you share with 2 other families, warm enough is a meaningful distinction. You point. The man behind the counter ladles into a small earthenware bowl. What you are eating is probably a pulse stew, lentils, chickpeas, or fava beans, cooked down with onion and herbs, or perhaps a grain porridge thickened with whatever was cheapest that week. If you are doing well financially, there may be a small piece of fish on top. If you are not doing well, there is not. There is, almost certainly, garum. Garum is fermented fish sauce, and it is the invisible architecture of the entire Roman diet. It is the salt, the umami, the seasoning, the condiment, and in some preparations, the primary flavor. It is made by layering fish, whole small fish, or fish entrails, with salt in large clay vessels, then leaving them in the sun for weeks or months until the contents liquefy. The result is a thin, dark, intensely savory liquid that Romans use the way a modern kitchen uses soy sauce, salt, Worcestershire sauce, and stock simultaneously. The smell of its production is what you would expect from fermenting fish in a Mediterranean summer. The smell of the finished product is considerably more manageable, though still assertive. You eat it anyway. Everyone does, and honestly, after a while, you probably stop noticing. But here is the part most historians quietly skip. The thermopolium is not merely a place to eat. It is also the only social space available to people who have no atrium, no garden, no dining room, which is to say, almost everyone. The wealthy Romans reclined at long tables in their private triclinia, eating elaborate meals in a particular order prescribed by social custom, consuming foods they would not dream of purchasing from a street counter. Everyone else ate standing up, shoulder to shoulder, at the stone ledge, in public, watched by the street. There was no shame in this. It was simply the arrangement. What was shameful in certain circles was eating alone. A Roman eating his meal in isolation, no clients, no freedmen, no companions of any kind, was a Roman making a visible social statement, and the statement was not flattering. Food was communal by default. The act of eating together, even with strangers at a street counter, carried a social weight that Romans understood instinctively and rarely discussed, because it required no discussion. The meat question was more pointed. If you are eating at a thermopolium on an average afternoon, you are probably not eating meat. Not because it is unavailable, butcher shops exist, and sausages are sold from other counters, but because meat is expensive, and the economics of Roman street food mean that the proteins available to most people are fish, eggs, and legumes, in that order of frequency. What meat does appear in the Roman diet, for people of moderate means, tends to arrive at specific moments. Feast days, sacrificial distributions, moments when the state or a wealthy patron kills an animal in public ritual and distributes portions to the crowd. You eat meat when the city decides you eat meat. This is not a hardship most Romans articulate. It is simply the texture of their week. The bread, at least, is consistent. Rome has professional bakers, pistors, and large communal bakeries operating continuously. Archaeologists excavating Pompeii found carbonized loaves still in the ovens, round, scored, dense, divided into 8 portions by a string pressed into the dough before baking. You can see the marks of the string. The bread survived the volcano better than most of the people. Now, the ingredient. What makes this especially unsettling is how long it took modern historians to fully reckon with it. The Romans sweetened their wine with a syrup called sapa or defrutum. Grape must reduced over low heat to roughly 1/3 of its original volume, thick and dark and intensely sweet. The best sapa, by Roman culinary consensus, was produced not in iron pots, but in lead ones. Lead vessels were preferred because they did not impart the slight metallic bitterness that iron could, and because the lead acetate that leached into the liquid during cooking added an additional sweetness of its own. Lead acetate is also called sugar of lead. It is a heavy metal compound. Chronic exposure causes neurological damage, kidney failure, and a slow degradation of cognitive function that presents in early stages as mood irregularity and fatigue. The Romans used it as a flavor enhancer in wine, which they drank daily, from lead-lined cups stored in lead-lined vessels, sweetened with lead-processed syrup. Some historians have quietly noted that the Roman ruling class, which consumed wine in the largest quantities and demanded the most sweetened varieties, showed patterns of gout, infertility, and erratic behavior at rates that are difficult to explain by chance alone. The emperors drank the best wine. The best wine had the most sapa. The sapa was cooked in lead. This is not health care. It is not even negligence in any modern sense. It is a civilization making the best decisions available with the information it had. The information it had was incomplete. Death wasn't dramatic. It was dietary. So while Rome fed itself from stone counters and lead, sweetened wine, it also produced a class of men whose entire professional existence was built around the body, its endurance, its damage, and the economics of both. What the gladiator ate for breakfast, and why his doctors kept him deliberately heavy, is a stranger story than most people expect, and it begins not in the arena, but in a kitchen that smelled of barley and ash. Welcome to the Ludus, not the arena. The arena is the performance. The Ludus is the machinery behind it, the training ground, the dormitory, the kitchen, the medical ward, the place where the spectacle is manufactured before it is sold. You are here in the early morning before the heat arrives. The smell is sweat and straw, and something sharper underneath, the vinegar they use to clean the treatment tables. Around you, large men move slowly. This is not laziness. It is preservation. A gladiator in the morning conserves himself the way a fire conserves fuel, deliberately, economically, because what he has is finite, and the schedule of its expenditure is not entirely up to him. You have been here 3 months. You have not yet fought in the arena. You have, however, eaten the same meal approximately 90 times. We will come back to what it is. The first thing to understand about a gladiator is that he is an investment. Not a man, or not primarily a man, in the accounting of the Lanista, the owner and manager of the gladiatorial school. He is a unit of capital. He has been purchased or conscripted, or in some cases has signed himself over voluntarily. And from the moment he enters the Ludus, he represents a sum of money that must be protected, developed, and eventually returned with interest in the arena. This changes everything about how he is treated. A Lanista who allows his gladiators to eat poorly is a Lanista who watches his investment deteriorate. A Lanista who allows unnecessary injury in training is a man burning his own money. A Lanista who permits his fighters to drink heavily, sleep badly, or contract preventable illness is conducting a kind of slow financial suicide. The result is that gladiators, by the standards of the ancient world, were looked after with a thoroughness that most free citizens never experienced. They had doctors, not the barber who doubled as a surgeon for the poor, not the folk practitioner who operated from a stall near the forum. Actual physicians, in some cases, trained professionals who had studied in Alexandria or had worked in military field hospitals, where the medicine was brutal and therefore often effective. The most famous physician in the Roman world, Galen, worked as a doctor at a gladiatorial school in Pergamon before he went on to treat emperors. He learned surgery in the Ludus. The arena, he wrote, provided him with more practical anatomy than any lecture ever had. This is what most history books quietly leave out. The gladiatorial school was, in certain measurable ways, the most advanced medical institution in its city. Galen's records from his time at the Ludus describe, with a precision that remains startling, the treatment of wounds that would be immediately recognizable to a modern trauma surgeon. Lacerations sutured cleanly, fractures set and splinted, dislocated joints manipulated back into position. He describes the importance of keeping wounds clean, not because he understood infection in any modern sense, but because he had observed empirically that dirty wounds killed and clean ones didn't. And he was practical enough to act on the observation. He also records the diet. Gladiators were called horderii, barley men. The name comes from their primary food source, barley. Not wheat, which was more nutritious and more expensive, but barley, the grain of horses and soldiers, dense and filling and cheap and calorie, dense in a way that served a very specific purpose. Gladiators ate enormous quantities of it, supplemented with beans and dried legumes, occasionally with vegetables, rarely with meat, almost never with the kinds of refined foods available to the wealthy Romans who paid to watch them. The diet was deliberate. What makes this especially strange from a modern perspective is that the men who designed it understood exactly what they were doing. A gladiator fighting in the arena is, in almost every style of combat, partially exposed. The Munamilo fights with a helmet and a large shield but bare legs. The Rishirius fights with almost no armor at all. The Threeks has a small curved shield and greaves, but an open midsection. Skin gets cut. This is expected. This is, to some degree, the point the crowd did not come to watch men bounce off each other. What a Lannister cannot afford is a blade reaching bone or organ. What he can afford, what he can, in fact, engineer, is a layer of subcutaneous fat substantial enough to absorb a shallow cut without reaching anything critical. The barley and bean diet built exactly this. A gladiator in the Ludus was not lean in the way that modern athletic culture fetishizes. He was heavy, deliberately and strategically heavy, padded beneath the skin with a layer of fat that functioned as armor. It sounds primitive. It wasn't. It was deliberate. The Romans had arrived, through observation and repetition, at a solution to a specific problem. How do you keep a man fighting, bleeding visibly enough to entertain a crowd, without killing him on? The first exchange, and the solution was nutritional. The barley diet was the engineering. 3 things had to be true for a gladiator to survive his first arena appearance. He had to be strong enough to fight. He had to be padded enough to absorb a cut. And he had to be healthy enough, specifically enough, that his body could recover between appearances, because a gladiator who fought once and died was a financial loss, and a gladiator who fought 12 times over 3 years was a profit. The third condition is the one that explains the ash. Galen records and other sources corroborate that gladiators drank a preparation made from the ash of burned plant material, primarily wood and charcoal ash, mixed with water and sometimes with oil or vinegar, ash water. This is not a recipe that survives in any modern wellness tradition, and when you first encounter it, it reads as the kind of folk remedy that well-meaning people practiced before real medicine existed, a superstition, a ritual dressed as treatment. It was neither. Plant ash is rich in calcium, specifically calcium carbonate and calcium oxide, which the body can process into the calcium it uses for bone repair and bone density. Gladiators sustained fractures regularly. The training alone, at the intensity they maintained, produced stress injuries that a modern sports physician would recognize immediately. The ash water was not a cure. It was a supplement. A calcium supplement, delivered in the crudest possible form, administered by men who did not know what calcium was but had noticed, empirically, that the fighters who drank it healed faster and broke less often. This is the thing most history books quietly skip. The gladiatorial medical program worked. Not in every case, not by modern standards, not without a casualty rate that would end any modern sport in an afternoon. But within its own terms, the terms of keeping expensive men functional for as long as possible, it was sophisticated, observational, and effective. The barley built the padding, the ash rebuilt the bones, the doctors sutured what the arena opened, and then there was the other product. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Specifically, explain that the sweat scraped from a gladiator's skin after training, collected in a bowl, bottled, and sold at market, was a premium cosmetic product, and that the women who purchased it were not considered strange for doing so. They were considered well, resourced. The strigil scraping from a champion fighter sold for more than the barley that fed him. His blood, collected after bouts on cloth or in small clay vessels, was sold as a treatment for epilepsy, drunk, or rubbed into the afflicted area, depending on the school of thought. His existence as a commodity did not end when the fight did. He was a resource at every stage, in every condition, producing value continuously until he was no longer able to. It was an economy, it was a system, it was Tuesday. The gladiator's body was measured, managed, fed, repaired, and sold by the gram. And yet the men doing the measuring, the Lannister, the doctors, the officials of the Ludus, operated within a city that had built an equally precise system for managing something far less predictable than a human body. What Rome did with fire, specifically, who owned the right to put it out, and what they charged for the privilege, is the kind of story that sounds like satire until you check the sources. It isn't satire, it's infrastructure. Welcome to the street at the third hour of the night. Everything is dark. Not the managed darkness of a city with streetlights and distant traffic glow, but the specific, total darkness of a pre-modern urban night. A darkness that sits on the rooftops and presses down between the buildings and is broken only by the occasional oil lamp burning in a window, or the torch of a man wealthy enough to have a slave carry one ahead of him. You are not that man. You are standing in the street outside your insula, and the building 3 doors down is on fire. Not a large fire yet. A cooking brazier left burning, or a lamp knocked from a table, or the kind of slow ignition that begins in the stuffing of a mattress and works quietly for an hour before it becomes visible. The flames are still contained to the top floor. The smoke is considerable. People are appearing in doorways. And now someone is running to find the vigiles. Here is what they will find. Rome burned regularly. This is not a metaphor. The city burned in 64 AD under Nero, the famous fire that destroyed 10 of Rome's 14 districts and generated one of history's most durable rumors about a man playing an instrument. It burned before that, and after that, and in between. It burned because Rome was built of wood and ambition and very little else, because its insulae were constructed quickly and cheaply by landlords with no incentive to use fireproof materials, because its population density was among the highest of any city in the ancient world, and because the Romans cooked, when they cooked over open flame in buildings that were, structurally speaking, tinder organized vertically. The city needed a fire brigade. What it got for much of its early history was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome at the end of the Republic, a distinction he had achieved through several methods, some conventional, some not. Among the not conventional was his private fire brigade, a trained team of approximately 500 slaves, equipped with buckets, hand pumps, and the rudimentary tools of fire suppression, stationed at strategic points across the city and ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. This sounds like philanthropy. It was not philanthropy. When Crassus received word that a building was burning, he dispatched his men to the scene. His men arrived. They stood in the street and watched the building burn. Crassus himself or his representative approached the property owner or the neighbors, whose buildings were now also at risk, and opened negotiations. He would put out the fire. He would save the building, or what remained of it, and the buildings adjacent. He would mobilize his 500 men and their equipment and their training, and the fire would stop. The price was the building, not a fee, not a service charge. The building itself purchased on the spot, at the price that a burning building commands, which is to say a price considerably below its value that morning. If the owner accepted, Crassus bought the property and extinguished the fire. If the owner hesitated, the fire continued to negotiate on Crassus's behalf. Most owners accepted. In this way, Crassus acquired a substantial portion of Rome's urban real estate at a discount that the market, left to itself, would never have offered. His biographer Plutarch records this without particular outrage. As a business practice, it was aggressive, but it operated within the space that the city's failure to provide public fire protection had left open. Crassus had not created the problem. He had simply monetized it with unusual efficiency. And honestly, after the third or fourth fire, the neighborhood probably stopped being surprised. The truly unsettling part isn't the extortion. It's that it worked well enough to make him the richest man in Rome. The vigiles arrived later. Augustus, reorganizing the city after the chaos of the late Republic, established the corps of vigiles, roughly translated as watchmen or night guards, around 6 AD. They were a paramilitary organization of approximately 7,000 men, divided into cohorts assigned to specific regions of the city. Their duties were split evenly between two functions: fire suppression and night policing. A vigile on duty was simultaneously watching for flames and watching for criminals, which gave him a professional interest in staying alert that most institutions have struggled to replicate. The vigiles were recruited primarily from freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted and were looking for a path toward full Roman citizenship, which 6 years of service in the vigiles could provide. This is worth noting. The men tasked with protecting Rome's buildings from fire were men who, until recently, had been legally property themselves. The city had opinions about labor. It had fewer opinions about contradiction. Their equipment was practical and limited. The primary tool was the bucket chain, lines of men passing vessels of water from a source to the fire, a technology so obvious and so effective at small scales that it remained standard for another 18 centuries. For larger fires, they had hand pumps, siphona, devices of Greek origin that could project a stream of water with some force, operated by 2 men working handles in alternating strokes. They had hooks on long poles for pulling burning material away from structures. They had axes for demolition. And they had vinegar. Here is the fire suppression method the Romans used that is, from a modern chemical standpoint, almost correct. Vinegar, specifically, large quantities of vinegar soaked into heavy woolen blankets or felted mats, was applied to burning surfaces and to structures adjacent to the fire as a preventative barrier. The Romans had observed correctly that vinegar, soaked material, was harder to ignite than dry material, and that applying it to a burning surface reduced the intensity of the flame. What they did not know, because they had no framework for knowing it, was why this worked. Acetic acid, the active compound in vinegar, does in fact lower the combustion temperature of organic materials and can interrupt the chemical chain reaction of sustained burning. The Romans had arrived at a genuinely useful fire suppression agent through pure empirical observation, centuries before anyone had a word for organic chemistry. They were right. They didn't know they were right. They used it anyway. The other strategy, the one that required more destruction and saved more lives, was the fire break. When a fire reached a scale that bucket chains and vinegar blankets could no longer address, the vigiles' commanders made a calculation. The fire must be contained, not extinguished. The way to contain a fire in a city of wooden buildings pressed together without gaps is to create gaps, to demolish the buildings in the fire's path before the fire can reach them, removing the fuel that the fire requires to continue. This meant that the vigiles on a significant fire were authorized to destroy buildings that were not yet burning. The owners of those buildings were compensated, eventually, through a process that involved the state and a timeline that the Romans were characteristically vague about. In the immediate moment, what you experienced was men with axes removing your walls. Best case scenario, the fire stops before it reaches you and your building is never touched. Worst case scenario, the vigiles decide your insula is the designated sacrifice, and you are standing in the street watching Romans demolish your home to protect someone else's, while the fire burns on the other side and the smoke turns the night, a specific shade of orange that you will remember for the rest of your life. It was infrastructure, it was governance, it was the math of acceptable loss. After the fire of 64 AD, Nero rebuilt with regulations. Buildings were required to be separated by minimum distances. Landlords were mandated to keep firefighting equipment accessible in common areas. The new structures were to be built in stone and brick rather than wood, at least on the lower floors. Colonnaded facades would allow citizens to fight fires from a protected position rather than the open street. Several of these rules were followed. Several were interpreted creatively by the same landlords who had built the wooden insulae in the first place. The economics of Roman property development were such that safety requirements and profit margins occupied an adversarial relationship, and the landlords had been navigating that relationship longer than the regulations had existed. What changed most durably was the night watch. The vigile's night policing function, the rule that any citizen found on the street after dark without a torch was presumed to be planning something criminal, became one of the city's most consistently enforced pieces of urban law. Not because Rome was especially concerned with crime, though it was, but because a man carrying a torch on a night street was simultaneously identifiable, accountable, and holding his own light source in a city where fire safety and darkness were the same problem viewed from different angles. The torch was the law. The law was the torch. Rome did not separate them. Rome had rules for fire and rules for the men who fought it and rules for the buildings that fed it. It also had rules, precise, legally codified, philosophically considered rules, for what happened when the fire reached a person rather than a building. What Rome did with its dead where it put them, in what order, with what ceremony, and what it required a family to do in the minutes after a man stopped breathing, is a system so elaborate and so specific that it suggests a civilization that had thought about death with the same practical intensity it applied to everything else. It had. Welcome to the moment just after, not the death itself. The moment after, the one that arrives before grief, has fully organized itself, before the practical weight of what comes next has settled onto the people in the room. A man has stopped breathing. He is lying on the bed or the floor or the street, depending on how the day went, and the people around him have approximately 60 seconds before Roman law begins to have opinions about what they do next. The first thing they do is call his name, not quietly, not as a question. The conclamatio, the ritual calling, requires that the name be spoken aloud 3 times loudly by the nearest family member or the person designated to perform the function. This is not grief expressed as sound. It is a legal and religious procedure. The calling confirms that the person is dead, that they did not respond, that they cannot respond, and it marks the moment at which the body transitions from a person with legal standing to an object with legal obligations. The name is called 3 times, no answer. Now the law begins. The first and most fundamental rule of Roman death is geographic. You cannot bury a body inside the city of Rome. This is not custom or tradition in the soft sense, the sense of something people do because their parents did it. It is codified law, present in the 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal text, dating to the 5th century BC and remaining in force with modifications for nearly 1,000 years afterward. The law states, plainly, that neither burial nor cremation may occur within the city boundaries. The pomerium, the sacred line that defines Rome as Rome. The body must leave, every body, every citizen, every slave, every infant, every executed criminal. The dead do not stay in the city. The city is for the living, and the Romans held this distinction with a firmness that shaped the physical landscape of the entire region. If you walk out of Rome on any of the major roads, the Via Appia heading south, the Via Flaminia heading north, the Via Oscensis toward the port, you walk into a corridor of tombs. They line the road on both sides, sometimes for miles. Large family mausoleums for the wealthy, columbariums full of small niches for the ashes of freedmen and slaves, modest stone markers for soldiers and tradespeople, unmarked patches of earth. Those whose families could not afford stone. The roads out of Rome were roads through the dead. This was not considered grim. It was considered proper. The dead should be close enough to visit and far enough to keep. The living should pass the tombs regularly, which they did, because the roads were the roads and you walked them regardless. Proximity to a notable tomb increased the value of nearby properties. Families built elaborate structures on the roadside not merely to honor their dead, but to advertise their own continued existence. An inscription carved in stone that said, in essence, we are still here, and we were always the kind of family that could afford this. Between the death and the road, there is the procession. The Pompa Funebris, the funeral procession, was, for those who could afford it, a significant public production. The body was washed, anointed with oil and spices, dressed in the best clothing the family owned or could borrow, and carried through the streets on a bier. Professional mourners walked alongside. The praefecti were women hired specifically to mourn. Their job was to weep, wail, tear at their hair, beat their chests, and produce on demand the full sonic range of grief, regardless of whether they had ever met the deceased. They were paid by the family. Their rate varied based on the volume and convincingness of their performance. A wealthy senator's funeral required praefecti of considerable professional capability, women whose wailing could be heard at a distance that reflected the status of the dead man's household. The logic was not cynical, or not entirely. In a culture where public display of grief communicated social standing, hiring professionals to ensure that your grief was adequately visible was a reasonable infrastructure decision. The dead man's reputation was partly carried on the volume of the weeping that accompanied him through the streets. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Specifically, imagine being a woman in Rome whose professional skill set consists entirely of crying convincingly and on schedule. She has clients, she has a rate. She has, presumably, a professional opinion about which families are worth working for. She is employed. Death wasn't theater. It was logistics with theater as a line item. For the wealthy, the procession included something stranger still. Actors wearing wax masks made in the likeness of the family's distinguished ancestors, sometimes going back many generations, walked in the procession dressed in the togas appropriate to whatever office those ancestors had held. A man whose great-grandfather had been consul was accompanied to his grave by someone dressed as a consul, wearing a wax copy of his great-grandfather's face. The dead arrived at the pyre or the tomb accompanied by all their dead. This is the moment, somewhere in the middle of your grief, where Rome stops resembling anything modern and starts resembling something older and stranger. The wax faces looking out from the procession were not representations. They were, in Roman religious understanding, presences the imagines, the ancestral images that lived in the atrium of the family home in small wooden cabinets, and were brought out for exactly this purpose. The dead attended the funerals of the dead. The family was not 3 generations. It was continuous, represented in wax, walking through the streets. And then there is the finger. Here is the law that has puzzled legal scholars for 2,000 years, and it involves the relationship between 2 different kinds of burial that Roman law required simultaneously. Rome practiced both cremation and inhumation, earth burial, at different periods, and sometimes simultaneously across different social classes. The legal and religious tradition held that for a body to be properly buried in the Roman sense, at least some portion of it had to be placed in the earth. Not burned, placed in the earth, covered, returned to the ground in the literal sense. Cremation, at the height of its Roman popularity, solved the space problem and the transportation problem and the preservation problem. It converted the body to ash efficiently and reduced it to something portable and manageable. But it did not, technically, satisfy the requirement of earth burial. The solution was the os resectum. Before cremation, a finger was cut from the body, just one finger, usually from the left hand. The finger was kept separate from the body and buried in the earth. A small piece of the person committed to the ground in the traditional manner, while the rest was cremated. This satisfied, legally and religiously, both requirements simultaneously. The body was burned. The body was also buried. Both things were true. It was a legal work, and so precise that it suggests a committee somewhere at some point had sat down and worked out the minimum viable quantity of human remains that constituted earth burial, and had concluded that a finger was sufficient. They may have been correct. The law did not specify otherwise. For those who died with nothing, no family, no savings, no patron willing to cover the cost of a proper funeral, there was the ustrinum, and there were the puticuli. The ustrinum was the public cremation ground located outside the city walls, where the bodies of the destitute were burned in communal pyres. Not elaborate, not annotated, not accompanied by wax ancestors or hired weeping. Efficient. The city managed the logistics of poor death with the same bureaucratic neutrality it applied to refuse collection. The puticuli were something older and worse, pits, common graves, into which bodies were deposited when even cremation was unavailable or not yet arranged. They predate the imperial period, belong to the earlier, rougher Rome, and appear in sources primarily when someone is trying to describe what poverty looked like at its most concrete. A man who ended in the puticuli had, in a practical sense, exited Roman society before he finished dying. This detail does not appear in the triumphal arches. It does not appear on the commemorative coins. It lives in the legal texts and the medical records and the occasional offhand reference in a letter. The way all cities' actual arrangements tend to live, in the documents nobody commissioned. Death wasn't tragic. It was administered, and the administration had a clerk, a rate, a procedure, and a geographic boundary that no one was permitted to cross while still carrying a body. Rome had rules for leaving the world, worked out to the level of which finger and how far from the city wall. It also had rules, entire volumes of rules, enforced by officials whose careers depended on it, for what you were permitted to wear while you were still in it. What a Roman put on in the morning was not a personal choice. It was a legal declaration. And the consequences of getting it wrong ranged from social embarrassment to something considerably more serious, depending on the color. Welcome to your morning. You are standing in your room, or the room you share, or the corner of the room you have been allotted, and you are looking at what you own. This does not take long. What a Roman of middling means owns in the way of clothing is approximately what fits in a small chest. A tunic or two, a belt, sandals, and if the weather or occasion requires it, something to put over the tunic. What you put on this morning is not a private decision. It is a public statement, a legal category, and in some cases, a prosecutable act, depending on what you reach for. Rome did not have a dress code in the way that a modern institution has a dress code, a list of rules posted somewhere that you might technically be unaware of. Rome had a dress code in the way that Rome had everything woven into law, enforced by social consensus, backed ultimately by the authority of men who had both opinions and soldiers. The clothing on your body told everyone who saw you exactly who you were, what you were permitted to do, and what you were not. Getting it wrong was not a fashion mistake. It was a statement about your intentions. There is one garment in Roman law that meant two completely opposite things depending entirely on who wore it. We will come back to it. Begin with purple. Tyrian purple is derived from the mucus secreted by a sea snail, specifically the Murex brandaris, harvested from the Mediterranean in quantities that required thousands of snails per ounce of dye. The snails were cracked open, the relevant gland extracted, the secretion exposed to sunlight and air in a process that produced, at various stages, an overwhelming smell of rotting shellfish and egg. Color that shifted from yellow, green through blue to a deep, saturated reddish, purple that did not fade in sunlight, did not wash out in water, and did not exist anywhere in the natural Roman world except on the backs of people wealthy enough to have bought it. The cost was extraordinary. Estimates vary, but Tyrian purple cloth at its peak value cost more per pound than gold. This made it useful. The Roman state recognized early that a color no one could afford was a color that could be legislated into a symbol of power without the legislation doing much practical work. The price did most of the enforcement automatically, but legislation followed anyway, because Rome preferred to make explicit what economics had already implied. Under various emperors, Tyrian purple in its fullest saturation was restricted first to the emperor alone, then extended to senior members of the imperial family, then, in a watered-down form, to senators who were permitted a broad purple stripe on their tunics. Equestrians received a narrower stripe. Everyone else received nothing, and the wearing of full Tyrian purple by an unauthorized person was not a fine. It was a political act, and political acts in Rome had a specific category of consequence. Several emperors executed men for wearing the wrong shade. This is not hyperbole. The sources record specific cases. A man seen in public in unauthorized purple was a man who had, through his clothing, announced either that he considered himself the equal of the emperor, or that he was too foolish to understand what he had done. The emperor tended to assume the former, and honestly, after enough executions, the fashion choice clarified itself. The toga requires its own accounting. It is perhaps the most recognizable garment in the Roman imagination, the broad draped woolen cloth that every illustration of a Roman senator reaches for, and it is, in practice, one of the most impractical garments ever devised for regular human use. A full toga comprises approximately 6 yards of heavy wool fabric, semicircular in cut, draped around the body in a specific arrangement that requires a second person to execute correctly and collapses into chaotic folds if the wearer moves abruptly, sits down carelessly, or encounters strong wind. It cannot be put on alone. It cannot be maintained alone. It announces structurally that its wearer has a slave whose specific duty includes standing behind him and making adjustments. This is the point. The toga was not a garment. It was a credential. Only Roman male citizens could wear it, and in formal civic contexts, addressing the public, appearing in court, attending the Senate, they were required to. The toga was not optional finery for occasions when you wanted to look impressive. It was the uniform of Roman citizenship, and appearing in public in a tunic alone, when a toga was called for, was the kind of absence that people noticed and remembered. Different togas carried different signals. The toga virilis, a plain, undyed, off-white, was given to a young man somewhere between 14 and 17 as his formal entry into civic life. The toga praetexta, with its purple border, was worn by magistrates and also, interestingly, by children, a detail that gives you some sense of how the Romans understood the relationship between those two categories of person. The toga pulla, dark, sometimes black, was the mourning toga, and wearing it outside of mourning contexts was considered aggressively peculiar. What makes this especially unsettling is what the toga meant on a different body. Roman women did not wear togas. They wore the stola, a long tunic reaching to the floor, belted at the waist, and over it, outdoors, the palla, a large rectangular cloth draped over the shoulder and sometimes pulled up to cover the head. This was the costume of the Roman matron, the respectable married woman, and it communicated, to everyone who saw it, a specific legal and social status. A woman wearing a toga communicated something else entirely. Specifically, it communicated that she was a registered sex worker. This was not innuendo or social code. It was law. The toga, Rome's preeminent symbol of civic virtue and male citizenship, was simultaneously the legally mandated dress of women who worked as prostitutes. The two meanings of the garment existed simultaneously in Roman law, in direct and apparently untroubled contradiction. The garment meant civic virtue on a man's body, and its precise opposite on a woman's. Historians have debated the logic at length. The most persuasive reading is that the toga marked both categories of person as fully public, the citizen male in his civic role, the sex worker in her professional one, and that Rome's concern was less with the symbolic contradiction than with the practical result, that everyone in the street could immediately identify both categories without ambiguity. Clarity, for Rome, took precedence over elegance. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Specifically, explain that the same garment meant senator and sex worker, that Roman law required both to wear it, and that a matron seen in a toga on the street would have found the experience significantly more upsetting than the sex worker, for whom the toga was professional dress, and therefore unremarkable. The matron would have had questions. The law did not have answers she would have found satisfying. Below the toga, the shoes. Footwear in Rome was a secondary text written in leather, a supplementary annotation to whatever the tunic and toga had already declared. Senators wore the calceus senatorius, a specific closed shoe in red or mulberry leather, fastened with 4 straps wound up the lower leg, distinguished by a small crescent-shaped buckle at the ankle. The crescent was not decorative. It was a rank insignia. A senator could be identified from 30 feet by the buckle on his shoe. Equestrians wore a similar closed shoe in black leather, 3 straps instead of 4, no crescent. Soldiers wore the caliga, an open sandal with a heavy studded sole, designed for marching and for grip on wet stone, laced up the lower leg in a pattern that distributed the weight correctly over long distances. The Emperor Caligula owed his nickname to these boots, having grown up in the military camps where his father commanded and been given a small pair as a child by soldiers who found him amusing. Slaves in most contexts wore nothing on their feet, or sandals of the most basic construction, in a style that made their status visible from the ground up. The street read its citizens from the feet to the face, and the reading was rarely ambiguous. The sumptuary laws, the formal regulations restricting luxury expenditure, attempted, at various periods, to legislate the rest of what Romans wore and ate and displayed. Julius Caesar stationed officials at markets to confiscate unauthorized luxury goods. Augustus issued regulations on who could recline at banquets and what could be served. Tiberius attempted to restrict the wearing of silk by men, on the grounds that silk garments were transparent and indecent for a Roman male. Every one of these laws failed, not loudly, not through repeal, but through the patient attrition of a wealthy population that found the restrictions inconvenient and the enforcement uneven. Rome's wealthy had money and lawyers and social relationships with the men doing the enforcing, and the sumptuary laws learned over centuries to coexist with the reality they were attempting to regulate. The purple remained restricted. The toga remained mandatory in its contexts. The shoes remained legible. Everything else negotiated its own arrangement. The wrong color could ruin you. The right color could carry you into rooms that your birth had not prepared you for. And the Romans, who understood that clothing was power made visible, dressed accordingly with the precision of people who knew that everyone in the street was reading them, and who had decided, consciously or not, exactly what they wanted the street to conclude. It was fashion, it was law. It was the same thing in Rome, which is to say it was never really either. Rome had built its architecture of rules from the bathhouse to the dinner table, from the funeral procession to the buckle on a senator's shoe. Every layer of daily life annotated, regulated, made legible to the street. But while Rome was perfecting its grammar of surfaces, what you wore, what you ate, what color announced what you were, something very different was already taking shape in the north. Something quieter, built not on display but on its deliberate absence. A system of rules just as precise as Rome's, and in some ways considerably stranger, designed not to make a person visible, but to make them disappear into a rhythm so complete it left almost no room for a self to occupy. It was written by a man living in a cave. It ran a continent for 800 years. And it begins at 2 in the morning with a bell in the dark. Long before the printing press, before universities, before most of Europe had a word for schedule, a single document was quietly running the continent. It was called the Rule of Saint Benedict. It was written in the 6th century by a man who had retreated from Roman society to live alone in a cave above a lake in central Italy, and who had found, in solitude, that he had strong opinions about what other people should do with their time. He wrote them down. 73 short chapters covering every aspect of communal religious life: when to wake, when to eat, when to work, when to speak, and when, under what circumstances, and with what precise degree of restraint, a monk was permitted to make a sound that resembled laughter. The document spread, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the patient water-on, stone persistence of something that worked in a period when most things didn't. By the 8th century, Benedictine monasteries operated across France, England, Germany, and the Italian peninsula. By the 10th, the rule had become the default operating system of Western Christian monasticism, not because anyone had decreed it universal, but because abbots who used it found that their communities functioned and abbots who didn't were managing chaos. We will start at 2 in the morning. The bell rings in total darkness. You have been asleep for perhaps 4 hours. You went to bed at dusk, or close to it, because the rule does not permit candles to burn past a certain hour, and because the day has been long and the body has learned to submit to the schedule even when the mind resists. You sleep fully clothed. This is not unusual. It is required. The rule specifies that monks sleep in their habits, their working clothes, so that they are ready to rise immediately when the bell sounds for the first office of the day, which is called vigils, and which occurs in the approximate middle of the night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, depending on the season and the abbot's interpretation. You rise, you do not speak. You have not spoken since Compline, the final prayer of the previous evening, which ended sometime around 8 o'clock and inaugurated the Grand Silencio, the Great Silence, which runs without interruption until after the morning prayer. The Great Silence is not the absence of speaking. It is the presence of something else, a structured quiet that the rule treats as a positive condition, not a negative one. You are not forbidden from speaking. You are inhabiting a silence that has its own texture, its own discipline, its own demands. You file into the church in the dark. You take your place in the choir stalls. Someone begins to chant. The 8 canonical hours divide the day into segments as precisely as any modern schedule, and considerably less forgivingly. Vigils at roughly 2 in the morning, lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour after sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none at mid-afternoon, vespers at early evening, compline at nightfall. 8 stops in a day that begins before the world is awake, and ends before most of the world has finished its evening. Between the offices, there is work, manual labor in the fields, or the scriptorium, or the kitchen. And there is lectio divina, sacred reading, conducted in silence alone. There is a period in the afternoon, in some communities, for sleep, the siesta that the rule permits during summer when the nights are short, and the day's 2 broken halves of sleep do not add to an amount that a body can sustain indefinitely. The sleep, in other words, comes in pieces. You sleep from dusk to vigils. You sleep again, briefly, from vigils to lauds. You may sleep again in the afternoon if your abbot permits it, and the season warrants it. The rule of Saint Benedict addresses laughter directly. What it says is not what you would expect. We will come back to it. A monk of the 8th century did not experience time the way you experience it. He experienced the canonical hours, the bells, and the intervals between them, and the quality of light, and the season's pressure on the schedule, which shortened nights and lengthened work periods in summer and reversed everything in winter. He did not need to know what hour it was in any numerical sense. He needed to know which office was next, and how much of the interval remained. This is not a primitive relationship with time. It is a different one, more granular in some ways, less abstracted in others. A monk who had lived by the rule for 20 years could feel the approach of sext in the quality of his hunger, and vespers in the angle of the light, and compline in the way the birds change. Register in the trees outside the cloister. The bell confirmed what the body already knew. The dormitory, the dorter, was a long room, common to all the monks of the community regardless of rank. No curtains, no private cells in most early Benedictine communities. A row of straw pallets or wooden platforms, spaced close enough that a man waking in the night could hear his neighbor's breathing. The rule specified that a lamp should burn all night in the dormitory, not for comfort, though it provided some, but so that the abbot or his delegate could enter at any moment and assess the room without lighting a candle first. The inspection was not announced. That was the point. Benedict's rule is preoccupied throughout its 73 chapters with the problem of private life, the space that a monk might carve out for himself inside the communal structure, the small sovereignties of preference and habit that, accumulated over years, constitute a self. The dormitory lamp, the open sleeping room, the habit worn to bed, all of these are architectural decisions that reduce the possibility of private life by reducing the possibility of private space. You sleep as you live, visibly, accountably, in the company of others. There was, inevitably, the problem of communication. The great silence created an immediate practical problem that the rule acknowledged without entirely solving. Monks still needed to communicate. Not constantly, not about personal matters, but functionally, pass the bread, the abbot wants you. Something is wrong with the well. The solution was sign language. Not a formal signed language in the modern sense, not a complete linguistic system with grammar and syntax, but an established lexicon of hand signals, specific to monasteries, documented in manuscripts that survive from the 10th and 11th centuries, and that are specific enough to be genuinely useful. The monastic sign for bread, a circle traced with 2 fingers and thumb, miming the shape of a round loaf. For fish, a lateral movement of the hand, miming a swimming motion. For wine, a tilted fist, thumb extended, miming pouring. For milk, the motion of milking. For the abbot, a touch to the ring finger, indicating authority. One sign was more complicated than the others, and required a specific sequence of gestures. I need to tell the abbot something that cannot wait. This sign was presumably used sparingly. The rule did not encourage its frequent deployment. And then there was the question of laughter. Chapter 7 of the rule, which addresses humility, and lists 12 ascending degrees of it, reaches near the top of the list this instruction: a monk should not speak unless spoken to, and when he speaks, he should speak gently and seriously, without laughter. Chapter 6 is more specific. It forbids speech that provokes laughter. This sounds like a comprehensive ban. It is not quite. Benedict does not forbid laughter itself. He forbids coarse speech, jokes designed to provoke uncontrolled reaction, and this is the precise phrase scurrility, which is the Latin word for the kind of low, crude humor that plays to the worst instincts of a crowd. What he permits, implicitly, is everything else. Modest speech, gentle wit, the kind of remark that produces a quiet recognition rather than a loud response. What the monks actually produced, over several centuries of life inside this constraint, was a culture of extremely dry, extremely quiet humored jokes that required careful listening, observations, delivered with a flatness that was itself part of the comedic structure, wit that would have been invisible to anyone not immersed in the same daily texture of offices and silences and small frustrations. The monastic sense of humor is preserved partially in the marginalia of the manuscripts they copied. Knights fighting snails, rabbits hunting hunters, a pig playing a stringed instrument with evident seriousness, a monk in the margin of a theological text, drawing a picture of another monk with a caption that the Latin translates roughly as, "He always falls asleep at vigils." Benedict had forbidden coarse laughter. He had not anticipated the snail. The bell rang whether you were ready or not. It rang at 2 in the morning in December, when rising meant moving from a cold straw pallet into a colder stone corridor. It rang in summer at the same hour, when the night was short and the sleep felt insufficient, even before it was interrupted. It rang on feast days and ordinary days and days when someone in the community was ill, and someone else had taken on their portion of the work, and the schedule had absorbed the additional weight. Without comment or adjustment, the rule had opinions about all of it. The rule had, in 73 chapters, expressed an opinion about nearly every situation a monk might encounter, from the correct way to receive a guest to the correct way to address a monk who had made the same mistake 3 times. What it had not managed to fully regulate was what a monk was permitted to eat, and the creativity with which the community approached that question once it became clear that the rules' restrictions had left certain zoological gray areas unaddressed, is a story that involves at least one animal with fur being legally reclassified as a fish. We will get to the beaver. Welcome to the refectory. This is the dining room of the monastery, and it is nothing like a dining room in any sense you carry from the outside world. It is a long stone hall, lined with trestle tables, lit by narrow windows and, in winter, by candles that are always slightly insufficient. The monks file in silence, take their assigned seats, assigned by seniority, because the rule has opinions about seating, and fold their hands while one of the brothers reads aloud from a lectern at the end of the room. The reading is always sacred, always Latin. In many communities, always continuous, the same text proceeding from where it stopped at the previous meal, as though the dining room were an extension of the Scriptorium and the food merely incidental to the study. You eat, you listen, you do not speak. If you need something that is not in front of you, salt, water, the bread that has been placed slightly too far down the table, you use the hand signals. The sign for bread, the sign for water, a small lateral gesture that means please pass what I am indicating with my eyes. The man next to you, if he has been here long enough, reads the gesture and responds without looking up from his bowl. The food in the bowl is not, by the standards of the outside world, bad. It is not good exactly. It is sufficient, which is what the rule intends. There is one animal that medieval canon law classified as a fish. It is not a fish. It has fur. We will get there. The rule of Saint Benedict permits 2 cooked dishes at the main meal. Not 1, 2. This is presented in the rule as a concession to human weakness, the acknowledgement that a monk who cannot eat 1 dish due to illness or personal difficulty should have a second option available so that he is not left unfed through no fault of his will. The 2 dishes are not a luxury. They are an insurance policy against individual limitation. What they are not is combinable. The rule does not say this explicitly. It does not need to. The logic is embedded in the structure. 2 dishes are provided so that a monk may choose one. A monk who takes from both is a monk who has made choice irrelevant, and the monastic system is, at its root, a system about the discipline of choosing correctly. You take 1 dish, you eat it, you accept that the other dish exists and that it is not yours. This produces, over years of practice, a specific relationship with food that the outside world does not share. Food as assignment rather than pleasure, the meal as a scheduled event with a correct and an incorrect way to approach it. Eating as a spiritual exercise in acceptance rather than a sensory experience with preferences. The monks who struggled most with this, according to the penitential literature that survives, were the ones who had come from wealthy households. They had arrived at the monastery having eaten well, having exercised preference daily, having known that a different dish was possible and better, and the refectory asked them to set that knowledge aside. Some of them never quite managed it. The ones who managed it became, in the community's understanding, somewhat more advanced than the ones who didn't. The inability to release a preference for better food was considered a spiritual symptom, not merely a personal one. The abbot watched who served themselves from both dishes. He watched who lingered at the table past the prescribed time. He watched who ate quickly versus slowly, and what the speed communicated about the person's relationship to appetite. Everything in the refectory was legible if you knew how to read it. The protein question was the most practically complicated aspect of the Benedictine diet. The rule prohibits, in plain terms, the flesh of four-legged animals for healthy monks. Quadrupeds are off the table, literally, except in the infirmary, where sick monks may eat meat as part of their recovery. The body's need temporarily overriding the rule's restriction. This exception was, across many centuries of monastic history, interpreted with a flexibility that the rule's author may not have anticipated. What remains available to the healthy monk is fish, fowl, and eggs. Fish was the primary protein, and its centrality to the monastic diet gave the refectory its most consistent smell. Dried fish reconstituted in water, fresh fish on the days when the monastery pond or the local river cooperated, preserved fish on the days when neither did. Medieval monks ate a great deal of fish. Records from English monasteries suggest a consumption level that a modern nutritionist would consider impressive and a modern eater would consider punishing. Eggs were versatile and relatively abundant where the monastery kept chickens, which most did. Fowl, specifically birds, occupied a middle category that the rule did not prohibit and that monastic communities used creatively, raising geese, ducks, and pigeons as supplementary protein sources that the letter of the law permitted. And then there was the question of what, exactly, constituted a fish. This is where medieval theology and medieval appetite met, and where medieval lawyers earned whatever the monastic equivalent of a fee was. The reasoning proceeded from a principle: fish are creatures of the water. Fish live in the water, are born in the water, derive their sustenance from the water, and return to the water. This is why fish are permitted during Lent and other fasting periods. They are categorically different from the land animals whose flesh is restricted. The principle was sound. The application became creative. The barnacle goose presented the first major test case. The barnacle goose is a real bird, a medium-sized migratory waterfowl that winters in coastal northern Europe, and was observed by medieval naturalists arriving in large numbers from the sea each autumn, seemingly without origin, since no one had observed it nesting in accessible locations. The explanation that developed, and that achieved serious enough currency to appear in multiple medieval natural histories, was that the barnacle goose was born from barnacles, specifically from the goose barnacles that attached to driftwood and floating timber, and that bore, if you looked at them with sufficient optimism, a slight resemblance to a small bird in a shell. The goose, in this understanding, was born of the sea. It was, categorically, a creature of the water. Several monastic communities, following this logic to its dietary conclusion, classified the barnacle goose as a fish for Lenten purposes and ate it on fast days without canonical difficulty. The Church eventually intervened. The barnacle goose was reclassified. The driftwood theory was deprecated, but not before the beaver tail ruling had already established a precedent. The beaver presented a different argument, and in some ways a more defensible one. The beaver lives in the water. It builds its home in the water. It feeds substantially in and around the water. Its tail, broad, flat, scaled in appearance, looks, to a medieval eye unfamiliar with beavers, quite unlike the tail of any land animal and quite like the tail of a large fish. The argument that was advanced and that was accepted by at least some dioceses in France and Germany, was that the beaver's tail, specifically the tail, not the body, was a fish. The body was a quadruped, the tail was a fish. A monk who ate only the tail of a beaver during Lent was eating fish and was therefore within the rule. This is not a joke. It appears in actual canonical discussions. The reasoning was considered and not universally dismissed. The beaver tail was eaten during Lent by monks who had concluded, through a chain of theological logic that was internally consistent if externally startling, that they had found a legitimate path through the restriction. The tail tasted like fish, they noted, dark, gamey, strongly flavored by the animal's aquatic diet. This was taken as further evidence. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Specifically, explain that medieval monks developed a detailed theological position on the tail of a beaver, that learned men sat in rooms and argued, in Latin, about whether the scales on a beaver's tail constituted sufficient evidence of aquatic origin, and that the conclusion they reached was, in several jurisdictions, yes. The rules said no four-legged animals. The monks heard no four-legged animals whose tails cannot be reclassified. It was theology, it was hunger, it was Wednesday. The liquid question was resolved with considerably less controversy. The rule permits a daily allowance of wine, half a pint by some calculations, though this varied significantly by community and by what the abbot considered a hemina to measure. What it does not address in detail is ale, mead, or the beers that northern European monasteries began producing as a practical response to the fact that water in many regions was not reliably safe, and wine was expensive and geographically inconvenient. Monasteries became, almost by necessity, the primary brewers of medieval Europe. They grew barley, they malted it, they fermented it, they produced ale in quantities that supplied not only the community, but the surrounding population. The term liquid bread was used by some communities to describe what a monk was permitted to drink during fasting periods, the caloric content of ale being sufficient to technically satisfy body's requirements without constituting food in the prohibited sense. This argument was also considered and not universally dismissed. The infirmary exception, meanwhile, continued to expand. A monk who was sick could eat meat. The definition of sick was, across different communities and different abbots, interpreted with varying degrees of strictness. Some abbots required visible symptoms. Some required a physician's assessment. Some abbots, particularly older ones who had watched their communities age and weaken on fish and barley, took a broader view that a monk whose constitution had been weakened by decades of monastic diet was, in a meaningful sense, always somewhat sick, and that occasional meat in the infirmary was less a violation of the rule than a concession to arithmetic. The rule endured. The monks were practical. The two things coexisted, mostly without direct confrontation, which is perhaps the most Benedictine outcome possible. The monks managed what they ate with theological precision and considerable ingenuity. They also managed, with the same combination of precision and ingenuity, what they were permitted to know. The Scriptorium held the library. The library held, among the expected volumes of scripture and commentary, certain texts that should not, by any strict reading of the community's purpose, have been there. What those texts were, and the fact that at least some of them were not merely preserved but carefully, attentively annotated, is a detail that the monastery's records mostly decline to mention. The marginalia do not decline. Welcome to the Scriptorium. It is mid-morning, somewhere between terce and sext, the canonical hours bracketing the central working period of the day. The light comes in from the north, from windows positioned specifically to provide consistent illumination without the glare of direct sun, which would wash out the vellum and make the fine work of letter forms difficult. Monks who have spent years in this room have learned to read the quality of morning light the way farmers read weather. It tells them how much useful time remains before the angle shifts, and shadows arrive and the work becomes approximate rather than precise. You are sitting at a writing desk. The desk is angled slightly, like a lectern, so that the vellum surface lies perpendicular to your line of sight, and your neck does not bend forward into the position that produces, after several years, the particular spinal complaint that the Monastery's infirmarian has learned to treat and quietly expects. In front of you is a page. Beside the page, in a small horn or ceramic vessel, is ink. In your hand is a quill of a feather, trimmed and split at the tip with a small knife called a penknife, which is where the word comes from, and which you have sharpened twice this morning already, because the vellum is slightly rough, and rough vellum destroys a nib with a patience that feels almost deliberate. You copy. There is a category of text that monks were forbidden to copy, but that several monasteries copied anyway, in full, and kept. We will come back to what it was. One Bible required approximately 200 sheepskins. This is not a metaphor for expense. It is the actual count, 200 animals slaughtered, their skins removed and scraped clean of fat and hair while still wet, stretched on frames, allowed to dry under tension until the surface achieved the specific taut smoothness called vellum, then cut into sheets and folded into gatherings. The sheep were raised in many cases by the monastery itself. The monastery's agricultural economy and its literary economy were the same economy, the animals in the field producing both food and the material on which the community's knowledge was recorded. The Scriptorium was not a luxury. It was the reason monasteries mattered to the outside world in ways that survived the individuals inside them. Kings needed documents, charters, legal records, correspondence, the administrative paperwork of governance. A king who wanted something written down with authority went to a monastery, because the monastery had the trained personnel, the materials, and the institutional reputation that made a document legible to other institutions. The monks copied for hours daily, in enforced silence, seated at fixed angles. The posture was managed because bad posture was a productivity problem. A monk whose neck seized after 2 hours was a monk producing nothing for the rest of the day. The light was managed for the same reason. The temperature was not managed because medieval stone buildings did not manage temperature in any meaningful sense, and the winter scriptorium was a room in which men copied manuscripts while their breath made small clouds above the page, and the ink occasionally thickened in the cold and had to be warmed before it would flow correctly. They developed occupational injuries that the infirmarian's records enumerate with a precision that suggests he had seen each of them many times. Cramped fingers, inflamed tendons in the writing, hand and wrist, deteriorating vision from years of fine close work in light that was always slightly insufficient, and the spinal complaint, which had a name in the medical literature and a specific treatment that involved rest and the application of warm compresses to the affected vertebrae. Rest was difficult to arrange when the schedule had opinions about every hour. A scribe who finished a manuscript sometimes left a note at the end, the colophon, which was the one space in the entire volume where his personal voice was permitted to appear. The colophons that survive are, in many cases, the most human things in medieval literature. A monk in 9th century Germany wrote at the end of a theological commentary, "Asterisk, the vellum is rough, the ink is thin, the light is failing, and my hand is tired, asterisk." A scribe in Ireland noted, "Asterisk, this is hard work, asterisk." Another wrote, "Asterisk, new parchment, bad ink. I say nothing more, asterisk." Several colophons end with variants of asterisk, thanks be to God. This is finished, asterisk, in a tone that suggests the thanks were not purely devotional. What the scribes wrote in the margins was less restrained. The marginalia of medieval manuscripts, the drawings and notations monks left in the white space around the sacred text, constitute one of the stranger archives in human history. The content does not match the container. A psalter with illuminated capitals and careful Latin script will, in its margins, contain a rabbit armed with a crossbow, hunting a human hunter who flees in what the drawing's composition suggests is genuine terror. A theological treatise will be bordered by a procession of snails, large, armored, apparently aggressive, against which a series of small knights have deployed with limited success. A monk at the page for 6 hours, copying text he has copied before, in silence, without speaking, without moving from his desk except for the offices. A monk in this condition will find that his mind produces images that the text has not authorized. The marginalia are where those images went. Some of them are rude. Some are portraits. Some are caricatures of recognizable figures that were recognizable to the original community, and are now merely strange to us. One English manuscript contains, in the lower margin of a page about divine mercy, a drawing of what appears to be a monk drinking from a large vessel with an expression that the illuminator had rendered with considerable technical skill and obvious personal familiarity. He always falls asleep at vigils. The correction of errors was a problem with theological weight. A scribe who made a mistake in copying had several options. The first and most careful was scraping, using the penknife to gently abrade the dried ink from the surface of the vellum, restoring the white surface so that the correct text could be written over it. Done well, the scrape was invisible. Done imperfectly, the text beneath left a ghost, a faint impression in the vellum that the corrected text sat over without quite hiding. The second option, for more serious errors or for texts being repurposed, was the palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been scraped, washed, and overwritten, the original text removed as thoroughly as possible, and the surface reused for new content. Vellum was expensive. Vellum from a monastery's own flock, processed and trimmed, was a resource to be managed. If a text was no longer needed, if it was outdated, superseded, or considered unsuitable, the material could be recovered and reused. The unsuitable texts did not always disappear. Ultraviolet light, applied to medieval manuscripts in the 20th century, revealed that many palimpsests had not been completely erased, that beneath the approved Christian text, the original writing still existed in the vellum's memory, faint and spectral, legible to instruments the monks could not have imagined. Pagan, philosophical texts, legal documents from the pre-Christian period, and, in several cases, texts that had been classified as heretical, scrubbed from the surface, overwritten with orthodoxy, but surviving underneath in the material of the page itself. The vellum remembered what the monastery tried to forget. The forbidden texts were not always pagan or heretical in the theological sense. Some of them were simply unsuitable for communities of celibate men who had taken vows and who were, theoretically, orienting their entire interior life away from the kinds of preoccupations that the forbidden texts addressed with considerable enthusiasm. The works of Ovid, specifically the *Ars Amatoria*, the *Art of Love*, a practical and unambiguous manual for the pursuit of romantic and sexual relationships, written by Rome's most technically accomplished poet and banned by Augustus for its perceived contribution to Roman moral decline, survive almost entirely because medieval monasteries copied them, not accidentally, not as an oversight in the cataloging, deliberately, carefully, in the same careful hand that produced the theological commentaries, with the same trimmed quill and the same scraped vellum, in the same scriptorium, during the same working hours, and annotated. Several surviving copies of Ovid's more explicit works contain marginal notes in a monastic hand, comments on the text, clarifications of obscure references, occasionally what appear to be personal responses to particular passages. The monks who copied the *Ars Amatoria* had, in many cases, read it carefully enough to have opinions about it. The monastery preserved classical learning because classical learning was worth preserving. and the men doing the preserving were educated enough to know the difference between a text's content and its value. Ovid was a better poet than most of what the period was producing, and the monks knew it, and they copied him anyway and kept him in the library in the section that was not available to novices. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Specifically, explain that the primary reason Ovid's love poetry survived 1,500 years was that celibate monks thought it was too good to lose, and that several of them left comments in margins. It was preservation. It was scholarship. It was a Tuesday in the Scriptorium, and the light was failing, and the text was interesting, and the man at the desk had not spoken to another person in 6 hours. The quill kept moving. The monks copied the world's knowledge with the patience of people who understood that they were the last line between a text and oblivion. They also copied, in the margins and colophons and occasional unguarded corners of their manuscripts, the record of what happened when medieval medicine attempted to apply the same confidence, same systematic, total conviction that it understood the body, and arrived at conclusions that were, from a modern standpoint, almost entirely wrong, and yet occasionally, by accident or by the patient accumulation of observation, almost entirely right. The barber surgeon is waiting. He has set down the razor and picked up the lancet, and he has a bowl ready, and he has very specific opinions about what is wrong with you based on the color of what is in the flask you handed him. When you walked in, he would like you to have produced more of it before your appointment. Welcome to the medical consultation. It is taking place in a wooden stall on the edge of the market, or in a room above a shop, or possibly, if you are in a city large enough and your complaint serious enough, in a physician's dedicated premises, which is distinguished from the surrounding buildings primarily by the flask in the window. The flask is glass, or polished horn, or clear ceramic, and it is filled with a yellowish liquid that you recognize immediately, and that tells every passerby what kind of establishment this is. It is not wine. You are here because something is wrong. The wrong thing could be almost anything: a fever, a persistent cough, pain in the joints, fatigue that has lasted longer than fatigue should, a swelling, a rash, a mood that has gone on too long, and changed color from sadness into something more uniform and harder to name. You are here because the alternative is doing nothing, and doing nothing has so far not worked. And this man in front of you has a reputation and a set of tools and a system so complete and internally consistent that it has been running largely unchanged for 1,400 years. He gestures to the chair. You sit, he picks up the flask. There is one medieval diagnostic method that involves tasting the patient's urine. It is also, from a purely chemical standpoint, occasionally accurate. We will come back to it. The 4 humors are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They are not metaphors. They are, in the medical understanding of the medieval physician, and everyone who trained him, and everyone who trained those people back through Galen and Hippocrates, and the entire weight of classical medical authority, the actual physical substances that comprise the human body and determine its functioning. Health is a state of correct balance among them. Disease is what happens when the balance tips, when one humor exceeds its proper proportion, or another falls short, or the quality of a humor changes from its correct temperature and moisture to something else. Blood is hot and moist. Phlegm is cold and moist. Yellow bile is hot and dry. Black bile is cold and dry. Each humor corresponds to a season, an age, a temperament, a time of day, a food type, a planetary influence. Blood predominates in spring, in youth, in the morning, in warm and moist weather. Black bile predominates in autumn, in old age, in the hours before dawn, in cold, dry conditions. The physician who knows the season, the patient's age, the quality of the weather, and the specific nature of the complaint has in this system a great deal of the diagnosis already assembled. Before the flask is opened, the flask when it arrives confirms or adjusts. Uroscopy, the examination of urine, was the medieval physician's primary diagnostic instrument, and it was practiced with a rigor and a systematization that modern medicine would recognize as methodology, even if it would not recognize the conclusions. The uroscopy flask, called a macula, was a specific shape, round at the bottom, narrowing to a neck, designed to correspond to the human body. The sediment at the bottom represented the lower organs. The body of the liquid represented the middle. The surface represented the upper, the head, the lungs. The physician held the flask to the light. He examined the color, which could range on the documented uroscopy wheels printed and distributed across Europe from the 12th century onward, through 20 gradations from white to black, each associated with specific conditions. He examined the clarity, whether the liquid was transparent, cloudy, or opaque. He examined the sediment, its color, its quantity, whether it had settled or floated, whether it was smooth or granular. Then, in some cases, he tasted it. This is the detail that tends to produce the strongest reaction in modern readers, which suggests that the modern reader has not fully reckoned with what the medieval physician was attempting to do. The physician was tasting for sweetness. Urine that tasted sweet, markedly, distinctly sweet, in a way that urine normally does not, was a recognized diagnostic category. The condition it indicated was called, in the medieval and earlier classical literature, the honey sickness or the thirst disease, or in the Ayurvedic tradition that fed into European medicine through Arabic scholarship, madhumaha, sweet urine. We now call it diabetes mellitus. The mellitus is Latin for honey, sweet. The observation was correct. A person with uncontrolled diabetes mellitus produces urine with a measurably elevated glucose content. Because the kidneys, overwhelmed by blood glucose, the body cannot process, begin excreting it. A physician who tasted this urine would taste something genuinely sweet, not imaginary, not metaphorical, but chemically present. The diagnosis the physician drew from this observation was wrong, embedded in a humoral framework that explained the sweetness as an excess of a particular humor rather than an insulin deficiency. The treatment derived from that diagnosis was therefore also wrong, but the observation itself, that sweet, tasting urine indicates a specific pathological condition, was accurate, arrived at through the most direct empirical method available, by men who had no alternative instruments, and who used the instruments they had without sentiment. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. A medieval physician, holding a flask of a stranger's urine to the light in a market stall in the 13th century, tasting it, concluding that something specific was wrong, was, in that moment, performing a diagnostic act that produced a correct result. The framework around it was wrong. The act itself worked. The barber, surgeon, was a different species of practitioner, and the distinction between him and the physician was the distinction between theory and practice in its most literal form. The physician had studied. He had read Galen and Avicenna and the texts that came through Arabic scholarship from the Greek tradition, and he had developed, through this reading, a comprehensive theoretical understanding of the body and its diseases. What he had not necessarily done was touch a patient with any instrument sharper than a pen. The barber, surgeon, touched people, constantly, professionally, with a range of instruments that the physician considered beneath his scholarly dignity. He cut hair, he trimmed beards, he pulled teeth, he lanced boils, drained abscesses, set fractures, sutured wounds, and performed, when required, surgical amputations, all with the same hands and in many cases the same room as the hair, cutting, which is a detail that does not bear extended contemplation. The striped pole outside his establishment was not decorative in origin. The red stripe represents blood. The white stripe represents the bandage or the lather. The pole itself represents what patients gripped during procedures conducted without anesthetic, squeezing until the knuckles whitened, because the alternative was moving and the barber. Surgeon's tolerance for movement was limited by the fact that he was holding something sharp. Some historians include a blue stripe representing venous blood, distinguishing it from the arterial red. Others suggest the blue represents the veins themselves, the roadmap the barber, surgeon, was navigating. The pole hangs outside barbershops today, spinning its stripes in a visual reminder of a medical tradition that most of the people walking past do not know they are passing. Bloodletting was the primary treatment for almost everything. This requires emphasis because the modern mind tends to receive it as hyperbole. It was not hyperbole. Fever, bloodletting, inflammation, bloodletting, headache, bloodletting, gout, bloodletting, mental disturbance, bloodletting, plague symptoms, bloodletting, with acknowledged uncertainty about whether this helped or merely added a controlled blood loss to an already catastrophic situation. The logic was internally consistent. An excess of blood being hot and moist, produced conditions of heat and excess moisture in the body. Removing blood removed the excess. The patient felt better often immediately after the procedure, the light-headedness that follows significant blood loss producing a calm, floating sensation that the humoral system interpreted as evidence of restored balance. The tools were specific. The lancet was a small, pointed blade for opening veins, quick, controlled, designed to produce a steady flow rather than a spurting wound. The phlegm was a broader instrument for larger incisions. The bleeding bowl was ceramic or metal, graduated on the inside with markings indicating volume, so that the practitioner could measure exactly how much blood had been removed and stop at the prescribed quantity. The prescribed quantity was determined by the patient's humoral diagnosis, their age, their sex, the season, and the phase of the moon. The phase of the moon was not a superstition appended to an otherwise rational system. It was integrated into the system at the level of first principles, the lunar cycle being understood to govern the tidal rhythms of bodily fluids, the way it governed the tidal rhythms of water. A bloodletting performed at the wrong phase was in this system, a bloodletting performed at the wrong time, not merely suboptimal, but actively counterproductive. The barber surgeon who ignored the lunar calendar was a barber surgeon whose theoretical foundation was questionable and whose patients knew it. 3 things had to be true for a medieval medical consultation to end with the patient in approximately the same condition they arrived in. The physician's humoral diagnosis had to be close enough to the actual condition to produce a treatment that was at minimum not harmful. The barber surgeon's procedure, if one was required, had to stop short of the threshold between therapeutic and catastrophic blood loss. And the theriac, the universal antidote and general purpose cure, all that the physician would likely prescribe as a supplementary treatment, had to contain, among its 64 ingredients, at least some that did something. Theriac was a preparation of Roman origin, attributed to Nero's physician Andromachus, and refined over centuries into a compound of such complexity that its production was a civic event in cities important enough to produce it. The preparation took 40 days. The finished product aged for years before use, like wine, the aging considered necessary for the ingredients to properly integrate. The ingredients included viper flesh, dried and powdered, on the theory that the venom of a snake was the antidote to its own bite, and by extension to all poisons. Opium in meaningful quantities, honey as the binding agent and the carrier, cinnamon, ginger, and a range of aromatic spices, approximately 60 additional compounds of varying plausibility, including, in some formulations, castoreum, a secretion from the castor sacs of beavers, which the reader who has followed carefully will recognize as an animal making its second appearance in this narrative. again in a context that its prior experience had not prepared it for. The opium worked, the honey soothed, the viper flesh did nothing specific but harmed nothing. The remaining 60 ingredients were, at best, a controlled experiment in aromatic chemistry. It was medicine. It was the best available. It was, on balance, what you had. Medieval medicine tried to manage the body through theory, to impose a rational framework on the irrational behavior of flesh and disease, and to intervene with tools and preparations derived from that framework. What it could not manage, what no bloodletting or thuriac or uroscopy wheel could address, was what happened when the disease came not as an individual complaint but as a weather system. Condition of the entire world that arrived without warning and moved through communities with the indifferent momentum of something that had no interest in the frameworks built to explain it. The Black Death did not care about the humors. It did not care about the lunar calendar or the color of the urine or the quantity of blood removed. It arrived in the monasteries in 1347, and what it did to the communities that had been built on silence and regularity and the patient repetition of the bell. What it did to the schedule, to the rule, to the records, and to the men whose entire lives had been organized around the assumption of continuation, is written down, in some cases, by the last man left who knew how to write. Welcome to the autumn of 1348. You are in England, though it could be France or Italy or the Rhineland or almost anywhere in Western Europe, because the geography has stopped mattering in the way it used to. What matters now is wind direction and trade routes and the movement of rats along the timbers of ships, and those things do not respect borders. The disease has been in Sicily since the previous autumn. It has been in France since the spring. It arrived in southern England through the port at Weymouth in June, and it has been moving north and west since then with the patience of something that is not in a hurry, because it does not need to be. In the monastery, the bell still rings, for now the brothers have heard the reports. Travelers passing on the road have described what they saw in Bristol, in Dorchester, in the towns closer to the coast. The abbot has held a chapter meeting, the daily communal gathering at which the rule is read and community business discussed, and has said what abbots in such moments are required to say, that the community should trust in God, maintain the schedule, pray for the afflicted, and continue. The community continues. There is a monastery chronicle that records the deaths of 3 brothers in a single month. The last entry is written in a different hand. We will come back to what it says. The monastery was, structurally, both the best and worst possible place to encounter a plague. Best because it was walled, because it was isolated from the densest urban populations, because it had its own food supply in the fields and fish ponds and gardens that the community maintained, because the rule had always imposed a degree of quarantine from the outside world, simply by regulating who entered and who left and under what conditions. A monastery that closed its gates in October of 1348 and admitted no one had, in principle, the resources to wait the plague out. Worst because of the dormitory, because of the refectory, because of the choir stalls where the community sat shoulder to shoulder 8 times a day to sing the offices, breathing the same air in the same stone room with the same narrow windows, and the same insufficient ventilation that medieval builders had always considered adequate, because the concept of airborne transmission had not yet organized itself into language. The rule required communal living. Communal living, in the presence of a pneumonic infection moving at the speed the plague moved, was the most efficient possible mechanism for ensuring that what arrived in one body arrived in all bodies in the fastest possible sequence. The monks knew something was wrong when the infirmarian ran out of beds. The mortality estimates among medieval English clergy during the Black Death range from 40 to 60%. And these are estimates derived from ecclesiastical records, from the documented vacancies in parishes and abbeys that required replacement, from the appointment records that show abbots naming successors who were themselves dead before the appointment was formally confirmed. The records have gaps where the record keepers died. This is a sentence that requires a moment. A chronicle, a register, an account book. These are continuous objects, their continuity maintained by the person writing them. And when that person stops appearing in their own record, document registers the absence as a change in handwriting, a break in the sequence, a date followed by nothing where a date followed by something should be. Some monastery chronicles end mid-sentence. Others end neatly with a final entry in a hand that appears for the first time on that page and never again a survivor or an arrival from outside, noting what they found and recording it with the monastic instinct for documentation that the rule had instilled deeply enough that it persisted even when the institution it was documenting had effectively ceased to function. What the chronicles record in the communities where documentation continued is a sequence that repeats with enough regularity across different monasteries and different countries to constitute a pattern. The first death, treated as an individual tragedy and noted with appropriate ceremony. The second and third deaths, treated as a concerning cluster. The subsequent deaths, arriving faster than the community can process them individually, noted with a brevity that is not callousness but capacity. The chronicler has limited time and is himself not well, and there are more names than there are words to give them. The brevity is the grief. The brevity is the entire thing. Flagellant processions arrived in many towns during the plague years, and the monasteries were forced to develop positions on them. The flagellants were lay groups, not monks, not clergy, mostly lay people from the urban and rural population, who had concluded, with the logic available to people watching a third of the world die without apparent reason, that the plague was divine punishment, and that the correct response was public self-mortification. They moved in processions of hundreds, sometimes thousands, through towns and across borders, stopping in public squares to perform rituals of collective self-flagellation, beating themselves and each other with leather straps tipped with iron points, while chanting, while crowds gathered to watch. The church's response was complicated. On one hand, penitential self-mortification was an established spiritual practice with a long tradition. On the other hand, the flagellants had begun making theological claims that the church had not authorized, that their movement offered an independent path to salvation, that clerical intercession was unnecessary, that the flagellant ritual was itself sacramentally efficacious. This was heresy, or close enough to require a response. The abbots who faced flagellant groups seeking admission to their monasteries made individual calculations. Some admitted them, provided hospitality, and sent them on their way. Some refused admission and recorded the refusal without comment. Some admitted them and then recorded, weeks later, that the community had subsequently experienced its first plague deaths. This correlation was not lost on the chroniclers. It appears in the records with a flatness that is not accusatory. The chronicler notes the admission, notes the subsequent deaths, does not draw the explicit conclusion because drawing explicit conclusions was not the chronicle's function. The juxtaposition does the work. The question of why required an answer, and the answers the period produced tell you more about what the Black Death felt like from the inside than any mortality estimate can. The theological position that the plague was divine punishment for human sin had the advantage of internal consistency and the disadvantage of producing a specific implication that several serious thinkers noticed and quietly set aside: that God was killing monks. That the men and women who had organized their entire lives around divine service, who had woken at 2 a.m. every morning for decades to praise God in the dark, who had given up property, family, and autonomy in the specific service of the institution the plague was now decimating, that these people were dying at rates comparable to or exceeding the general population, suggested something about the relationship between piety and protection that the theological framework was not equipped to address cleanly. Some chroniclers addressed it directly, and the passages that survive are among the most unguarded things in medieval writing, not because they express doubt in any modern sense, but because they express confusion at the level of first principles, a confusion that the training the writers had received had not prepared them to articulate, and that they articulate anyway in Latin, in margins and colophons and final entries of documents that nobody expected to be read by people 14 centuries later. Why? The word appears in various grammatical forms, in places where it should not appear if the framework is holding. The framework was holding, and also it was not holding. Both things were true simultaneously in the same handwriting on the same page. Some monasteries were simply emptied. Not destroyed, not burned, not deliberately disbanded, simply left without enough living members to maintain the rule, to ring the bells, to unlock the gate in the morning, to perform the offices that the schedule required. A community of 40 monks reduced over 3 months to 6, and those 6 managing the physical and spiritual obligations of 40 with the resources of 6, and then 4, and then the question of whether 4 monks in a building built for 40 constitutes a community in any meaningful sense becomes a practical question rather than a philosophical one. The bells stopped being rung in these places not because anyone decided to stop ringing them, but because the person whose turn it was to ring the bell was dead, and the person who would normally take over was also dead, and the remaining person was in the infirmary and could not reach the bell tower on their own. The bell tower fell silent. In several documented cases, the monastery continued to exist as a physical structure for years after this point. The buildings standing, the gardens reverting to wildness, the library locked but intact, the manuscripts still in their places on the shelves. Travelers passing near these locations noted the silence. The silence was legible. A monastery that was not ringing its bells at canonical hours was a monastery that had, in the most functional sense, ceased. Now the last entry, a chronicle from a small Benedictine house in the English Midlands. The specific attribution is uncertain. The document surviving in a later copy records 20, 3 deaths across a single month, in the autumn of 1348. The entries are brief as they always become. A name, a date, sometimes a function held in the community. Celera, sacristan, the prior, the subprior. The final entry in the original hand records a name and a date in October. Below it, in handwriting that is visibly different, slightly larger, less practiced, the hand of someone who had learned to write, but had not spent years in a scriptorium, 2 words in Latin. Asterisk et postea silentium. Asterisk and after this, silence, not an explanation, not a lament, not a theological reflection on what the deaths meant, or what God intended, or what the community had done to deserve the sequence. A factual notation, a record of what the record itself had become. After this, silence. Silence was, in the end, what the monastery had always been for. The rule had built the silence deliberately, maintained it across centuries, broken it only for prayer and necessary speech. The plague took the builders. What remained was the architecture they had made: the stone corridors, the choir stalls, the scriptorium desks, the angled windows, the bell in its tower, and the quiet that had always lived. Inside it, what that silence eventually became, and what the monastery left behind in the world it had spent centuries quietly running, is a longer story than most people expect. Clock on your wall, the university your children might attend, the calendar that structures your week. All of it began with a man in a cave and a bell that rang at 2 in the morning, and a community willing to get up. Welcome to the end. Not the end of history. History does not end, which is one of the few consoling things about it. The end of this particular thread. The one that began in a Roman bathhouse with grey water and a curved metal blade, moved through a fire brigade that charged by the building, a gladiator eating ash, a dead man's severed finger, a toga that meant two opposite things, and arrived by way of a cave in central Italy, in a monastery that fell silent in October of 148, and did not ring its bells again for a very long time. What survived is the question. The monastery preserved things. This is its permanent claim on history, not its theology, not its architecture, not even its agriculture, though all three contributed to the shape of Europe in ways that are difficult to overstate. What the monastery preserved, in the specific and irreversible sense, was text: Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, Aristotle, Tacitus, Livy. The works of classical antiquity that the Roman world produced and then lost custody of, as the institutions that had housed them collapsed the libraries, the schools, the administrative structures that had kept Latin literate and Greek accessible, survived primarily because monks copied them, not because anyone issued a directive to preserve classical learning, not because the monks were classical enthusiasts, though some were, because copying was what the Scriptorium did, and the texts that arrived in the Scriptorium were copied, and the texts that were copied survived, and the texts that were not copied mostly did not. The margin between survival and loss was a monk with a quill on a cold morning in a poorly lit room, copying something that had been copied before and would need to be copied again. There is one invention that almost certainly would not exist without the medieval monastery. It is not a book. It is something you use every day. We will come back to it. That margin is the reason we can read Tacitus on the reign of Tiberius, and the reason we cannot read the lost books of Livy, because Livy was copied in some monasteries and not others, and the ones that copied him burned or flooded or were dissolved, or simply ran out of monks before the work was finished. The history of classical antiquity is the history of what the monasteries chose to copy, or happened to copy, or copied by accident in the sense that a text arrived and a monk was available and no one had specifically said not to. The lost texts are the ones where the chain broke at some point between Rome and the Scriptorium, or between one Scriptorium and the next, and were not recovered. What we have is what survived the chain. What we do not have is the rest. The university grew from the monastery in the way that a river grows from a spring, not suddenly, not through a single decision, but through the patient accumulation of direction. The cathedral schools that predated the universities were, in most cases, administered by clergy and staffed by men trained in the monastic tradition. The curriculum they offered the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy was the curriculum that the monastery had developed to train its own members in the skills required for the scriptorium, the liturgy, and the administration of the community's affairs. Bologna, the first European university in any formally recognized sense, emerged in the 11th century around the study of law, Roman law, recovered and systematized by scholars working in tradition the monasteries had maintained. Oxford emerged from a cathedral school, Paris from the school attached to Notre Dame. The institutional form of the university, fixed curriculum, recognized degrees, the authority to certify knowledge, descended directly from the monastic model of structured learning within a regulated community. The dissertation defenses that still take place in universities today, the formal examination before a committee, the candidate defending a position against challenge, are a secularized version of the monastic disputatio, the formal theological debate conducted according to strict procedural rules that the monastery had used for centuries to train its members in systematic argument. The cap and gown that graduates wear are simplified versions of the academic robes that were themselves derived from clerical dress. The ceremony has outlasted its origins by several centuries and shows no sign of stopping. The clock is the invention. Specifically, the mechanical clock, the clock driven by an escapement mechanism, which is the device that converts continuous rotational energy into the measured, interrupted movement that produces regular time keeping. The escapement is the tick. Without it, a clockwork mechanism runs continuously and rapidly until it exhausts its energy source. With it, the mechanism is interrupted thousands of times per hour in a regular rhythm, and each interruption marks a unit of time, and the units accumulate into minutes and hours, and the clock becomes useful. The first mechanical clocks in Europe were built in the 13th and early 14th centuries, and they were built to do one thing. They were built to ring bells, not to display time. The clock face, the hands, the visual representation of the hour, came later as a secondary development. The first mechanical clocks were mechanisms for automating the monastic bell ringing schedule. A monastery needed bells rung at 8 specific intervals across the day and night, including at 2 in the morning, when no human watchman could be reliably trusted to stay awake. A mechanism that ran without sleep and rang a bell with the regularity of the canonical hours was not a luxury. It was a solution to a problem the monastery had been managing with human labor for 700 years. The clock was built to replace the monk who rang the bell at vigils. From that single functional purpose, the automation of prayer time, the mechanical clock expanded into every other domain of human life that required the measurement of time, which turned out to be all of them: the merchant who needed to track contract durations, the physician who needed to measure a pulse, the navigator who needed to calculate position at sea, the factory, when factories came, that needed to coordinate shifts across hundreds of workers. The clock that wakes you in the morning, all of it descended from the bell in the monastery tower, and the community's need to ring it in the dark without fail. The monastery built the clock to serve God. The clock outlasted the monastery. The clock outlasted the God most people meant when they said the word. The clock is still running. The rule of Saint Benedict is still followed today, not as a historical curiosity, not as a reconstructed practice, but as a living daily discipline, by an estimated 40,000 monks and nuns in Benedictine communities across the world, observing, with local adaptations and modern interpretations, the same structure that a man in a cave wrote in the 6th century for a small community above a lake in central Italy. The canonical hours are still prayed. The great silence is still kept in communities that maintain it, from compline to the morning office. Meals are still taken in the refectory with reading. The chapter meeting still gathers the community daily to hear the rule and discuss its business. The abbot is still elected by the monks and serves until death or incapacity. The monasteries that survived the plague rebuilt. The ones that were emptied were sometimes repopulated by monks from other houses, sometimes left to decay, sometimes repurposed by the secular authorities who found themselves in possession of valuable stone buildings and productive agricultural land. Henry Roman VIII dissolved the English monasteries between 1536 and 1541, not gradually, not through individual assessment, but systematically, legally, with the administrative thoroughness of an institution that had learned from the Romans how to make a large decision and execute it without sentiment. The buildings became private estates. The libraries were dispersed. Some of the manuscripts ended up in private collections. Some ended up in what would become university libraries. Some were lost. Some survived. The Great Silence has a modern descendant in the silent retreat movement, practiced by people who have no particular interest in Benedictine theology, but who have discovered through experience. That extended silence changes the quality of thought in ways that are difficult to describe to people who have not tried it. Certain psychiatric rest protocols incorporate enforced quiet periods. Certain clinical environments have begun studying the neurological effects of reduced auditory input on stress physiology. Benedict did not know about cortisol. He knew about silence. He knew that it changed something, and he built an entire civilization around the daily practice of it. And the civilization lasted longer than most. The hospital shift runs in most systems in 8-hour increments, 3 shifts across the 24-hour day. The academic term divides the year into segments separated by rest periods. The workweek imposes a rhythm on 7 days that has a direct precursor in the 6 days of labor and 1 day of rest structure that the Benedictine schedule inherited from earlier religious tradition and formalized into something Europe could observe collectively. The scheduled life, the life divided into units measured by bells, organized around fixed obligations at fixed intervals, is so natural to the modern person that it requires an effort to see it as a historical artifact at all. It feels like the shape of time rather than a shape imposed on time. It is a shape imposed on time. It was imposed by a document written in a cave, spread by communities of men who woke at 2 in the morning to sing in the dark, maintained through plague and dissolution and reformation, and encoded into the mechanical clock that eventually made the bell unnecessary. The bell rang anyway. 1,500 years of ringing leaves a mark in the air that takes a long time to stop. The Romans had rules for the bathhouse, and the bread stall, and the dead man's finger. The monks had rules for sleeping and eating, and the kind of laughter that was permitted. Both civilizations built systems so complete that the people inside them stopped seeing them as systems and started seeing them as the world. Both were right, both were wrong. The water in the Roman bath was always gray. The vellum in the Scriptorium was always cold. The bell rang whether anyone was awake to hear it or not. The beaver tail was classified as a fish in 3 separate dioceses by men who had studied for years to arrive at that conclusion. And somewhere in a monastery in the English Midlands in October of 1348, a man whose name the record does not preserve sat down at a desk and wrote 2 words at the bottom of a page full of other men's names and closed the book, and that was the end of the chapter, and the chapter was enough. The bell rings whether anyone is awake to hear it or not. If you're still watching, that means you made it all the way through the ancient Rome with me. So thank you for staying. And if you didn't, that's kind of perfect, because these stories were never meant to be rushed. They're meant to linger slowly in the background until your mind lets go. So whether you're still here or already asleep, I'll see you in the next one.